number of programs on railroad history, who ran into Joe McDonald, and they were talking about stagecoach history, so Jerry passed your name along, and that's why we made this particular connection. Joe's been at the history business of these 30 years and specialized in steamboats for a number of years. Exhausted that subject?
No.
Hardly. But moved on from there to Stagecoaches. He's published books these last 6 years, is that correct? And his stagecoach productions have been the stagecoach lines and stations west of the mountains. Then he did stagecoaches and the stations here in eastern Oregon, and he has just published a book on the stagecoach lines and the old stagecoach routes of eastern Washington. And I think you have some books along, and
One more.
one more.
What is that?
That's Western.
Only one left. Oh, okay. Well, you can talk to him afterwards about those books, and I want you to give a warm welcome to Joe McDonald and all his artifacts that he's brought along here today.
I need to interrupt. If your cell phone is on, would you please turn it off? As a courtesy, please. Thank you very much.
We'll start with, and I ask everyone, if they got a question while I'm talking about anything I'm talking about, we don't have to wait till the very end to ask the questions. First, I want to tell you how I got started in the stagecoach business. I was doing a book on steamboats, which I found out after I got started, there's going to be 3,200 boats on the Pacific coast, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, Alaska. And I ran across a thing they call a vulture. It looks like this. And this was for the Oregon Stage Line, which ran from Sacramento to Portland in 1860. And of course, that was 720 miles. It was a huge undertaking. And in those days, everybody got paid in gold or silver. So in order to show that you got paid, you had to sign a vulture. And the manager would make out these vultures, and he'd say, for whatever purpose. This particular one is for ranching a bay horse. This fellow at Robinette Station, which was down in the valley, got paid $4 for taking care of this horse. And your drivers and your hostlers and your innkeepers and everything were paid by these vultures, and this is how they kept track of who got paid. In 1864, Courthhouse, I'm sure everybody heard that name, he bought the stage. And one of the reasons he used was because the stage company, the original one, which was the California Stage Company, was being paid by the government, but during the Civil War, the government issued greenbacks. When they first came out here, everybody being patriotic decided to accept these things, but they finally realized that the only thing that we had really to sell to back east was gold and silver or mining. So before very long, the greenbacks were discounted 25% and 50%. When you took the Oregon Steam Navigation Company boats up the river, they had two prices, one for gold or silver and one for greenbacks. And the greenbacks, it cost twice as much to do it. In fact, there was a case over here in John Day where a man had worked for this gentleman for about 3 months. And when he came to get paid, the guy paid him in greenbacks. Well, he shot him. Well, he got about half what he should have did. But he must have been a character because they brought him to trial and they finally hung him. I kind of feel like that was justified, that he should have shot the guy for not paying the full amount, but he must have been a very good fellow. Anyways, that's how I got started in the stagecoach business, and it had to do with the stage that ran down the Willamette Valley to Sacramento. And that stage line, there were 60 stations. And about every 60 miles, they had a home station where you could stay overnight and eat. So a horse would go down 12 miles, in the morning or in the afternoon, and 12 miles back, so it always ended up in the same stables that he began with. If you know anything about horses, they like to do the same thing. They want to be in the same stables, they want the same, they just like things that are constant. In some cases, the horses knew more about the route than the guy driving the stage line. I started this book on Eastern Oregon with a little story, and I'll read a little bit to you. The young boy stood near the edge of town looking north down the road. He'd been staying there for quite some time. The sky was overcast from the morning rain, making it difficult to see the shapes moving up and down in the distance. As the shapes got closer, he could see tops of the hats and then the face. He turned and started running down the road to the general store, calling out, "It's coming, it's coming." As he stopped to scrape the mud off his boots, he could see that his father was preparing the mail sacks. "Father, it's coming," he said, almost out of breath. His father looked up and got one of the mail sacks onto the table and filled it with outgoing mail. "Here, take this to the porch, and be careful. It's still wet out there." As he lugged the sack to the porch, he could hear the stage coming into town. The stage pulled up to the store, and the driver threw back his lap cover and pulled the mail sack from under the seat, setting his brake before climbing down. Well, this is generally how our mail got delivered. The stages were contracted by the government to carry mail from one place to another. They did this what they call star routes. And the star route was a contract to carry mail to post offices. And generally the route was given to a person for 4 years. And it was generally given to a person that they knew could carry the mail and also was the lowest bidder. So sometimes if it was too low, they had to replace it with another man that could carry the route. Without the government contract, there would probably be no stages. Because the mail paid the contractor every month. So he had a salary to depend upon. In 1868, the post office in Oregon sold somewhere like 32,000 stamps and other things that they had for sale. And it cost the post office $380,000 to deliver mail to the state. So when they start talking about our present post office not making any money, well, can you imagine what $380,000 was in 1860? It was a whale of a lot of money. But the reason for this was that they used the post office to knit our country together. If you're coming out from Ohio and you're settling out here in Burns or something like that, I mean, you probably wouldn't want to come unless you did get a letter from your parents or your relatives or something like that. So the post office has always been a service, a government service. They were the first in every form of transportation we have. We probably wouldn't have had stagecoach lines without the post office. Railroads were subsidized by the post office. Airlines were subsidized by the post office. Every mode of transportation has always been subsidized by the post office. So I get a kick out of when people start saying today, well, they're not making any money. Well, it wasn't until probably in the 40s that the post office ever made any money. So all those years, I mean, you got to remember that delivering a piece of mail thousands of miles for 3 cents. So it was one of the government services. It was the only government service that a person out here in those days would even have any contact with the federal government. Because unless you were a crook or something and you printed money, you had no reason to be involved with the federal government because they had laws against printing money that wasn't printed by the government. So every stage line that I know of had a subsidy by the federal government. And what it did was it brought money into these far-flung communities because they bought horses, they bought feed, wagons made, blacksmith, inns. I mean, if you lived out here in these little towns, in 1860. The question is, how are you going to get any hard currency? You couldn't, you could maybe sell a cow or something like that, but it was very difficult for these people. Most of them never hardly saw $20 from one year to the next. So with having this $300 and some thousand being spent delivering mail, it brought a lot of currency into the little towns and the cities, especially out here in Eastern Oregon. The Dalles, as we all know, was the center of all transportation in the east side of our great state. The first line we had ran from here to Walla Walla. Before the steamboats started bringing mail up to Wallula, and then what's his name? Built that strap railroad. Baker built a strap railroad from Wallula to Walla Walla. And I guess that the top speed of this little strap railroad was like 4 miles an hour. Some guy said, I can get off the walk alongside this thing faster than you can get it there. But it was the first, other than the pony railroad at the Dalles, it was the first railroad in Oregon. Just the other day, I was looking on the computer, and I came across a great photograph of a stage being met by a car on the way up to Cloud Cap. I don't know how many people have been up to Cloud Cap. There's one. I'm going to try and get up there tomorrow if the snow's not too deep. But stage ran to Cloud Cap when the first day was open. They had an area just before you got up there called China Phil. I think they call it China Phil because I think China were the ones that built that section of the road. But it was quite steep. So even in the 20s and the 10s, when they had automobiles, they still could only drive the car as far as China Phil, and the stage was going to take them the rest of the way up to the Cloud Cap. A lot of people think when the railroad came, the stages died, but they really didn't. Stages ran in some places into the 20s because the roads were still so bad. You got to think of back in those days, these were single lane roads. There was really no maintenance. The only maintenance they had was they taxed you. I think it was, this one here is not from here, it's around the Anvil County. And the poll tax was $3, or you could do $3 worth of labor. Well, you can imagine if a guy's going to go out and work, he's going to probably work in front of his house or in front of his farm or something like that. And this was the only maintenance that these roads had. It wasn't until 1917 that we had a highway department, and then it was some years later when we floated a huge bond to build highways. So even into the middle 20s, some cases in the wintertime, they still use stagecoaches. The things that helped the building of the roads or improving the roads were two things. One was bicycles. When the bicycle craze came in the 1890s, late 1890s, they kind of pushed for better roads. And then we had the free rural delivery, which came probably in this area in 1901s. And one of the requirements was that the roads had to be passable all year round to get a free rural delivery route on your to your farm or whatever. So people started to spend a little money on the roads and kept them up. There was a railroad that ran from Dix Junction down to Shantico. And Shantico was kind of a hub center for stagecoach, and they would then take a stage from there down to Redlands and Prineville and Bend. But it was kind of funny that the stage that ran from Shantico to the Dalles even continued to run after the rail was made, because you could actually make better time by coming across Shears Bridge and then coming into the Dalles that way than you could have taken the railroad from Shantico down to Biggs Junction, then wait for the train that came down along the Columbia River to come into the Dalles. So even when the railroads came, a lot of people think the stage has died, but they really didn't. What happened was the stage then ran from the railheads to whatever little towns were all around the countryside. So there was actually more stages, because as the railroad came, there was more people traveling. Because they all looked forward to railroad. Stage wasn't the easiest way to travel. Not much travel in the wintertime. It was very cold. The only thing they could do for a person traveling in the wintertime, they could either heat a brick, or they had a little thing that made out of tin that they could put some coals in it, and they could put that at your feet. But there wasn't any other heat in those stagecoaches. In the summertime, of course, when it's nice and warm, and you're behind 4 or 6 horses, you're eating a lot of dust. So once in a while you'll see stages with an open top. And the reason for that is because how you like to be sitting in a stagecoach, the curtains down, it's hot, and you dust flying all over the place. So it wasn't the most pleasant way to travel. The drivers were paid about $60 a month. The hostler, which is the man that when you brought the horses in, he would take care of the horses and put them in the stable. They got paid about $40 a month. When I started, I found this vulture. I decided I was going to get a vulture from every station on that particular stage line, which there were 60 stations here in Sacramento. And over the years, I was able to get one from every station, and some extra ones like from Wolf Creek, which at that time was not a station, but the creek was too high to ford, so they stayed overnight at the end there. And so I feel myself very proud to be probably the only person in the United States that's got vouchers for every one of those stations. That particular line ran until 1887. So it ran from 1860, but of course each year it got smaller because the railroad kept coming down the valley. It came down to Roseburg in 1872, but stayed there for 10 years before they continued the line down to Ashland and across then finally in 1887 across the Statiions. I think there was either 7 or 9 tunnels they had to build on the Statiions to get that train over the Statiions. They don't use that route now. They use the route going up the Willamette drainage on up to Central Oregon there, just south of Bend. Not only was the Dalles the important town in the eastern Oregon, but it was also important to eastern Washington because the first stages that ran into Goldendale and then into Yakima and into Ellensburg came through here. In the 1860s, of course, they built that, what they call a military road down to John Day area. And it would have left the Dalles, cross the Chutes River, and come down the east side of the Chutes River, and then go down to an area where Shannico at that time wasn't a station, or wasn't even a town. And it went down to the Dalles. They had a little trouble on that road from Indians, so they finally built a place called Fort Watson, where they had some volunteers from the Oregon militia that had a camp down there for, I don't know, maybe a little over a year, which kind of patrolled the road because they had been attacked a few times at their stations in that area. We always remember that everybody talks about the Concord coach. And most likely, there was a few that were used out in this area. There was some shipped off that line that I talked about that ran from Sacramento to Portland. Because the line got small, they didn't need as many stagecoaches. But most of the coaches out here, they are called mud wagon. And they had the same suspension system as a Concord stagecoach. It was what they call a thoroughbred system, which was like 8 layers of leather that went around a fixture on the back and the front axles, so the coach would sway back and forth like this. Concord coach cost about $2,000 in 1860, and $2,000 in 1860 was one lot of money, so it's one of the reasons. The stagecoaches didn't have lights. Generally, in these smaller routes out here, they try not to run at night. But in the other routes, like that one where I keep talking about on the one to California, they didn't run night and day on that route because they had to make that distance in 7 days. The mail contracts called for certain times that you had to deliver the mail. They gave you leeway maybe a couple of hours, but if you're over that couple of hours, the post office would discount your contract. Horses, most stages had 4 horses, and if they're running in a mountainous area, they'd have 6 horses. You see some evidence of them using mules, but it's awfully funny when you start researching this, it's hard to find any information about the mules they use. This photograph that I got off the computer the other day from on this route that went up to Cloud Cap. It shows when they leave their cars, there's a 2-mule horse team that ran them up there. But you don't see too much. Mules, first place, cost more money than horses do. You probably cost you once and a half again what a horse would cost you. And in this area, of course, your mail came in originally from steamboats. So your mail came in from on the steamers, and they would then take it down to John Day. I have one good example of an express company. Before there was stagecoaches, there was express companies. And this is an express company, Van and Nelson Express, for the John Day mines. And this is a cover plus a little butter, which has 2 gold nuggets in it. This gentleman is sending his father-in-law 2 gold nuggets, and his father-in-law is in Jackson County, Oregon. So that would have came from John Day through Liddell, boarded a steamer, went down to Portland, got on a stagecoach, and took a stage all the way down to Jacksonville. Everybody that handled the mail had to take an oath that they would perform their duties. And most of you had to first have to be American citizen before you could even handle that. It was, being a postmaster, one of the few jobs that women could get. So there's a number of different post offices that women handle. And you can imagine a lot of times, even when the man of the family was postmaster, that his wife did a lot of the work at the post office. What happened if you had an accident? Well, normally, the stage company would pay for any hospitalization required, but there was no other payment. You didn't get any payment for suffering or anything. They just took care of where the doctor was. A Chinaman, if he's riding the stage, they would list him on they did what they call a way bill. On a way bill, you listed all the passengers and any freight and any mail you're taking. They would always list him as Chinaman. So in most cases, they never named him. There was a case where out of the Prime Villa, a Chinaman was going to go to visit some relatives in Portland. And he got on the stage and he got a few miles out of town, and a bunch of cowboys stopped the stage and got the Chinaman out and cut his queue off, the little pigtail that they wore on the back. And the people in town weren't too happy about it. This guy was a pretty good cook. Well, after that happened, he never came back to town again. They weren't, Chinese men would ride the stage because if they were just out on the road, the chances are they'd be robbed. So they didn't, so you'll find, I've never found a case where an Indian ever was listed on a stage culture. Of course, before there was the Stagecoaches, we had the express companies, and there was a number of them that ran out of the Dalles and down to John Day, and actually ran north of here too, up to Yakima. Not so many, maybe just like one. And eventually what happened to all of them, they were taken over by Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo became the primary. Contrary to a lot of people think, Wells Fargo did not run stages in our area at all. They contracted the stage companies to carry their bullion with them. The reason there was a bullion is because you'll see some old bills from companies, and in those bills they'll always say, payable in gold coin. So when they were doing business between companies, they had to ship gold coins back and forth. And this is one of the prime things that Wells Fargo did. Although they did also ship mail, they were required to put a 3-cent postage stamp on any mail they shipped, even though and then you would pay another fee for the Wells Fargo to handle it for you. One of the, quite often you'll run into the Liberty Company stables. They'll also run stagecoach lines because they would have all the equipment. They'd have the wagons, they'd have the horses and everything like that. So I would say about 20% of the stage lines are run by somebody who would own a livery stable. Back again on these greenbacks, like I say, when they first came out, they were accepted. And later on, they weren't. In fact, you would find notices in the paper, so-and-so pays his bills in greenbacks. And that would mean, don't do any business with this guy. Most ministers and anybody in the transportation business would have free passes on any stage line. And that would be the same thing. They would give the same right to the stage owner to have free passes on the other line. There would be a little bit of freight. And I think baggage was limited to about 40 pounds. As much baggage you could carry. You could sit up with the driver while you're driving the stages if he would invite you there. If he didn't invite you up there, you were not allowed to sit up with the driver. Stage stations, like I was saying on the main route that ran to Sacramento, they were every 12 miles. And this would really vary here. A lot of people ask me, well, was this house on a stage? Was a stage stop? I said, was it on a stage route? Was it built before, 1900? And they would say yes. I said, well, it was a stage stop because they stopped wherever they could pick up passengers. Not that it was a stage station. And a lot of times, stage stations would change. There was one, especially outside of Jackson, that's called Barron's. And of course, you figure they ran from 1860 to 1887. Well, over the years, the next farm would be the stage stop. The farm prior to that would be the stage stop. So they didn't always stay the same. And like the first rural free delivery route in Oregon was in 1897, and it ran from Turner, just south of Salem, and it went up the river to Mendenhall. Is there any questions you might have?
How much did it cost to be a passenger? Or did it vary?
It varied. Generally, it started out about 5 cents a mile, and then it would go up to 10. After some time, it went up to 10 cents a mile. I think the trip between Portland to Sacramento was like $55, which is still a lot of money in those days. Yes.
You said that before the stage lines, there were things called express companies.
Yes.
What did they use to
They just
transport?
used the horse. They
They
just,
used the horse.
yeah, they mainly just carried mail
Mhm.
and maybe a little bit of bullion, but they would, they just used the horse, right? They might use pack horses too if they had a lot of bullion. Excuse me, yes,
Did the Pony Express come to the Dells?
no, the Pony Express came to California, but it only ran for about 18 months. So, yes,
Stage robberies, always in the movies.
they're always in the movies, isn't that? I was reading something the other day about, it was in Arizona, they actually had a woman stage robber. And they brought her to court and everybody kind of felt sorry for her, so they kind of let her off. But she had robbed the stage with her boyfriend or whoever it happened to be. But that's the first time I ever ran into a woman stage robber. Because she's dressed up in kind of men's outfit. You know, there was some stages held up over in eastern Oregon, over near the Powder River, mostly Indians. There was some bandits where they crossed the Snake River. In fact, I think they had a ferry crossing. The bandits had taken it over. They got together a bunch of vigilantes and went after them. They drove them out of there. It's a pretty good story. But that was pretty early. That's probably 1865 or something like that. But there was, Indians did a good story about the stage line. They're running from the south of the border, and they're going up to Silver City, Idaho. They went through eastern Oregon, excuse me. And there was a bunch of men and a lady on the stage. And they got up, maybe 100 miles north of the border, and they were attacked by Indians. The woman had a dog, and she and the stage driver, they got out and shot at the Indians. The rest of the men got out and hid in the brush. So when they got to Silver City to register at the hotel, the men used the phony name to register. They didn't want to know that they had been brought out. So the woman and the dog and the stage driver were the one that drove out the Indians. But most of that was pretty early when that happened. Any other questions? Just
Just a comment. You were talking about the mules going up to Concap. I've interviewed a bunch of the elderly men over in Sherman County, and that led me to interview Eldon Wagenglass, who's in one of the homes here in the Dalles. And he said back when he was a child that, so it would have been after the time you're talking about, the horses died from mountain fever, where the mules did not die from mountain fever. So maybe that's why. It sounded like there were a lot more.
well, there was, yes. I mean, if you look at a book on veterinarians on horses, it's about this thick. I mean, you cannot, I found out the other day, it's another disease, they had mud fever. And this happened when you were like mostly happened in the western part of the state because, you know, the water would be standing, there'd be mud, there'd be ice, and they would have to, they could run a horse one day, have to leave them off 2 days. So you kind of cure from that. But I don't know how many different diseases a horse can get.
I wondered if the mountain fever was saliva-borne, because in Sherman County there were some mules, but mostly it was the workhorses, where in Wasco County it was mostly the mules.
I couldn't tell you, I don't know that much about it, but I do know that mules can withstand a lot more. They're not quite as fast as the horse in some cases, but they can stand up to a lot more rigor than a horse can eat, and they can eat almost anything.
What Bill Hulse also is a local guy here, he said that the horses had to be groomed. The mules were just work animals. He said they had one so mean, they harnessed him in the spring and left him harnessed till. But he think when they had the nerve to die in the scab field.
Well, I know, I mean, everybody that talks about ornery mules, but you know, I think it's probably like anything. It's, you got ornery dogs, you got ornery horses.
Well,
You get,
Eldon said if you were not nice to them, they weren't.
oh, I think they remember it better than the horses
Yeah,
did.
yeah.
Yes, I think they did.
So we had, I've taken photos and talked to most of the people in Sherman County about the barn. There's 3 that were, that they talked about being stagecoach stops.
Yes, yeah, but they did cost more. Actually, horses were cheap up until the First World War. And what happened was the French came over here. You know, we had all these wild horses over in eastern Oregon and Washington. And they come over here and started getting them up. They were getting like $200 for a horse. A horse, you wouldn't get $35 for it. But they were taking them over fighting the First World War, which they lost millions of horses and blown up. Did that movie just recently, The War Horse, which is kind of gory. It's a pretty good movie, but it wasn't one I wanted to see more once. Yes.
In Wasco County, what were the stations between the Dalles and John Day?
Oh, there you go. Quite a few.
Somebody told me that every 10 miles, they had a station from here to Duford, Ty Valley, and so on, going over Bake Oven to Sherry.
Right.
I think I have a copy of the stagecoach stops in this area.
I haven't been here, but there's a lot of stage stops. Like you said, they usually went to Bake Oven and Shantico, and then Antelope, and Alderwood, and then Prineville. Then the road turned off and went over to John Day Country. So you went down that way to Mitchell, and like I say, not every time, there's no stage stops that always stayed the same place. They moved around depending on who the contractor was. Maybe you had a buddy who was on the road or something like that. So they weren't always in the same spot. And so a lot of times, it's very difficult to get every one of them, because sometimes they're only there for a year or something like that.
Yeah, you said earlier Turner, Oregon had first, was this an RFD, Rural Free Delivery mail route? Or was this just for carriage of mail between offices?
No, it was a free world delivery route.
Okay, it was an
The
RFD.
first one in Oregon.
Okay, so it's the first RFD route in Oregon.
Right, I think the first one in eastern Washington was Yakima. But they had a requirement that you had to have a road that was passable year round.
Yeah.
So that helped a lot for getting the roads into shape, because people wanted to get their mail delivered if they could possibly do it. There was also, with these star routes, there's also, I know up in Morrow, they were, the guy would have a star route, and he would agree with the postmaster that he would stop at certain places and deliver mail. You know, they put up some kind of chute or something they could mail it. But this was more of a in-house agreement. It wasn't anything that was contracted by the government. This is one thing I should tell you about. In the turn of the century, more people were employed, directly or indirectly, by U.S. Mail than any other business in the United States. And they operated this whole system with a legal-sized piece of paper, 8.5 by 17. And it came out every day except Saturday and Sunday. And it operated this entire system. When you think about it, not only was it the whole United States, there was also stuff being shipped to Europe, or wherever else. And on this thing, it would tell you what post offices opened, which ones were closed, what contracts were made with the railroad, the steamboats, even people who were just got a job delivered, taking the mail from the train station to the post office. And I just marvel at this system, and it worked. I mean, most people, there's very few criminal actions in the post office. There was sometimes when a postmaster would get his money mixed up a little bit. They did have a man that came around, and they checked on postal routes and post offices and everything like that. But you think of the thousands and hundreds of thousands of people working for this company, and the minute amount of graft that went on, it's just amazing that this system works so well. I think it works so well because everybody wanted it to work. I mean, the mail had to go through, which is kind of a cliche, but everybody believed in that. There was one case where they bring the mail up from John Day, and there was a storm, and they crossed the river, and of course they're freezing to death. And he went through all these different things to try to get the mail into the house. He got there, and he's 3 hours late. They dumped him. There's a long story about what this poor guy went through to get the mail here. He gets here and he gets docked for it because he's late delivering the mail. But I think that's one thing you can be very proud of in our country is our mail service. Contrary to a lot of people say today, it's really tremendous. And I hate to see it go. Any other questions?
I have one comment. My grandfather delivered the mail between Grass Valley and Antelope this would have been the 1930s during the Depression. They had a farm out of Antelope, so they moved to Grass Valley so my mother and her brother could go to school because by then there was no high school in Antelope. Anyway, every day he drove the mail stage, he delivered he started in Grass Valley, he delivered to Kent, and I can remember later, he had this big canvas bag, same kind of canvas bag, and have a lock on it, and there would be one left at Kent, one left at Chanticleer, then he'd take one to Antelope, then he'd go to the farm for the day. This is about 9 miles out of town before past Brian Beach, where you drive down there. And then in the afternoon, he'd come back, pick up the mail, go do the reverse back to.
Now, you drove a car or?
We drove a car or a pickup. I mean, this is early 30s. But the one thing my mother said was that this was during the Depression. He had a steady income because he was paid in money rather than vouchers. And nobody had very much of anything, but that got them through the Depression.
Yeah,
And yet they call it the mail stage. They still call it the mail stage. The mail stage comes into Antelope at I think it's like now about 11 and leaves by 1. And they're much shorter hours, but they still refer to it as the mail stage. And country people, especially the retired men, all come to town if you want to see everybody. It's about 11 o'clock in the morning.
well, that was one of the things about having the state. We're talking nowadays about having the closing mail post office. Well, back in the early days, there was no such thing as a post office. It was inside somebody's store. So when they talk about this, I don't get too excited because, I put it in so-and-so's store. That's the way it started. They didn't all have these separate post offices all throughout the country. But the idea of cutting back, I don't even mind about the Saturday thing, but we're going to really miss it if we get rid of our post office.
But we're so impoverished, we can't afford things that our ancestors managed to create.
When you think of the government spending $380,000 a year to get mail to the people up in this state, and now they're saying, why doesn't it make money? I don't even understand.
It's not a government institution anymore.
Well,
why they wanted people.
They still can't raise their rates unless they get
That's
a
why they-
contract.
That's why they put the money.
You know, the problem they're having now, I mean, what I understand is that they require to put so many billions of dollars in the retirement thing that it's more than anybody's putting in retirement, and it's just killing them, they don't have any capital left to spend, so it's not that everything the post office did is right. There's nothing everything black people do is right, you know, but generally, it's a good system, and it's operated since the founding of our country.
How often did you have to be late to the mail before the government approved the contract? Is there any sentence for that?
Oh, you know, it's probably a little bit of politics. You know, it never got, you gotta realize that the original postmaster and all these guys were political assignments. This is what, even to my, what really has amazed me, how this thing operated so well. It wasn't up until, I think, in the 30s or something, or later, I mean, when they decided they couldn't be just political appointments, but it was always, you point a postmaster because they voted for you, you know, this kind of thing. But still, even then, the system worked, which is, you know, we'd say today, well, that can't work, but it did work. I think of all the mail that went to the state, the Congress, 90-some% of the mail to the congressman was about post office. Are you gonna open a post office in my area? I didn't get my letters on time. This is the main contact that people had with their government, the federal government. It's all about post office.
Are you familiar with any routes in Umatilla County?
Well, yeah, they did
The
that.
reason why I ask is that we know of one, it's supposed to have been a station, and it's kind of a vacation home now, but the way the road looks like it meandered through the trees and up and down the mountains and so on.
Well, I remember right.
I don't know how they got
It's
there.
in my book someplace, but it ran down, you know, along the Umatilla River to Pendleton.
Well, this is way up above, out of Weston.
Oh, you mean that route?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I'm thinking it went from Milton Freewater, Weston,
Yes, I know.
Elgin,
Yeah.
and then probably to the Dalles or Wallowa.
Let's see, it went to, the valley over there. But anyway, that was a wild route. Came up that way. There's about 3 or 4 stations along that route. I can't just read them off to you, but they're in the book.
But the road, you know, what may have been the stage route,
Right.
I don't know how they.
Oh, I don't either. I mean, that whole area there, north of the route that went over the Blue Mountains there's a couple of routes that went up in that area, and I don't know how the blast they got up through there. I mean, it was just, I drove up there a couple of years ago. It's not bad because they got a paved road, but I'm thinking, what the heck, you do up there with the state?
Yeah. Well, this is, I don't know.
That was hard to find though. I had to do a lot of research to find exactly where the state station is.
Yeah.
Because like I say, they didn't always stay the same, they changed.
About 10, 12, maybe 15 years ago, they had a wagon train that came through. And I think they may have used part of that route. But it went through the trees.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, that was, I never did figure out. Of course, there wasn't any really good route to get there. Even one we call 84 at that time was a tough route. That was a toll road. You know, when the railroad came through, they bought the toll out. They bought the toll right away. The short one, I think it was. The short one. Oregon Shoreline?
I'm sure,
I'm
probably.
pretty sure it was.
In the 70s, I got to run some private property with a 10-year-old nephew, and out to see an old stage line. The deal was we didn't touch anything that we saw, and they didn't let people on this property very often. And there was still some tack hanging on the walls, and stuff. It was just
Oh,
about a
really, that's
mile.
neat,
It
yeah.
was just about a mile we walked, but it was down a gully and a stream was going along there.
Yeah,
And it was, the wind was blowing and it was just, we were both real quiet. And he was so careful not to touch anything, it was just like being in a living museum. It was really neat. Howdy, Cody White.
well, you know, when you do research in it, you just amaze you. There's probably not one square inch of ground that these guys in those days didn't walk over sometime or other. I mean, they were every place. You wonder what the guys worked on, they're always wandering around the countryside. Yes.
Joe, I think we have to wrap up pretty quick, but could you tell us a little bit about a lot of artifacts here? What do we want to look at here?
These are photographs of different stage stations. This one in particular is from Crescent City to Jacksonville. This is the stage that ran out of Jacksonville there. I wish I had more large photographs of stages in eastern Oregon, but let me tell you, there just wasn't a whole lot, but a lot of postcards. This is one here from over on Bend stage. It's a six-horse stage out there. Now this is still a mud wagon, but it looks a lot like the difference between a mud wagon and a Concord coach is the size would have been wood and the stage this way. This is a stage that's out of Roseburg going to Myrtle Point. This was one of the companies that took over from Corbett and ran the stages down the valley. As you realize, the train came and the lines got shorter, but guess what? You ran more stages. When you unloaded this train, you might have 30, 40, 50 people getting off that train to get on to go over the mountain to get the train going to San Francisco. So, although it was shorter, there was a lot more stage running at that time. Any other good questions?
When did the stages stop running? What year?
Actually, last one I found was in Trinity Valley, which is Northern California, and that was like 27. The same reason was the roads were so bad in the wintertime, you couldn't get cars, so they run stage. A lot of times the stage was not what you see here. It was just a buggy, but the requirement was to carry mail and carry passengers. So that's the requirement for a stage. And in fact, later on, you can use the stage as a download. The stage that ran out of Primeville up to Shantico in the winter months, they ran stagecoaches. In the summer months, they ran on. So they call them stages, by the way. The early cars that carry passengers and mail, they call them stages. I got a little problem when you start to say, well, what date did they cut off? Because I just said, I don't care. I'm just going to go to 1920, I call them stages anyways. Well, I hope you got a little information on me. And there's these artifacts here on my own collection. I think the most valuable one is this one, this express letter with the gold in it. And I'm very proud that I got my hands on it. But there's books for sale. I didn't imagine people wanted so many books and couldn't bring that day. I do have another one here, which I was using as in my talk here. But thank you. It's a nice group here, and if I can learn something from you too.
Well, stick around, have some